Good afternoon and welcome to Jewish Book Week and to a beginner's guide to Jews on the edge. I'm delighted to be able to introduce two fantastically astute who explore the edges in both their fiction and non-fiction. Frequently hip, always funny, totally engaging, not always funny, frequently funny when they mean to be. And today they will be looking at the edges of Jewish identity, and if this is the beginner's guide, I'm really interested to see who gets to teach the advanced class. But Will Self and Adam Thirlwell.
I'm always puzzled by the flowers being on the table at literary festivals. It's just a certain grim...
A funeral
quality to it. But there you go. What can you do?
Okay, so we'd like to stress that we didn't actually choose the title. And I think this, the idea for this conversation began when Will and I were both at a festival in Lyon, where Will gave a talk in praise of the French novelist Céline, who famously, as well as being a very great novelist, was a very passionate anti-Semite. And we're published actually by the same publisher in France who is also Jewish. And I remember that as we were walking along after this talk, our editor said, of course, the best Jews are the anti-Semitic Jews. And it was that point I thought this could be quite a fun conversation. I think we add up to one whole Jew.
Well, it's always a moot point. I mean, I always say, and it's a significant thing in English society, I think. If I'm speaking to Gentiles and I say I'm half Jewish, they always say, this is Gentiles, your dad or your mum? And I say my mum. Well, you're Jewish then. These are Gentiles. And I say, no, that's what the Jews say. Now, whether you view that as a terrific success on the part of
Orthodox Jewry,
of Jews imposing a matrilineal line on the collective, because you wouldn't say to somebody who was, for example, Chinese or black, who said that their mother was black, you know, you can't imagine white, non-Jewish English. Well, you're black then. Well, you're Chinese then. It doesn't really add up. And you know, my mother was not observant herself. She'd been bat mitzvahed. She grew up in Queens in the 1920s and 30s, but was not observant herself. And I wasn't brought up observantly at all. So I think that it would ill behoove me to claim to be more than half Jewish. Makes sense. I don't know how you feel about it, Adam. You need to set out your Jewish
my tradition.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
matrilineal?
Matrilineal.
You're Jewish then? Oh, sorry.
You can't hear. Matrilineal, and but I would say barely culturally Jewish is my tradition. But it's the same that I often feel very embattled, where you are kind of forced to become more Jewish than I be by this matrilineal idea. And it's very strange, I think, kind of where this comes from, why you're not allowed to have kind of a two-part identity rather than just forced into kind of one bracket. I mean, I remember I felt this rather personally. A couple of years ago, I wrote a piece in the Jewish Quarterly called On Writing Half Jewishly, which I thought was a sweet, flippant, nice little piece. And then the editor of the Jewish Quarterly said that there was a letter in from Cynthia Ozick, the Jewish novelist, the American Jewish novelist, attacking me virulently, which was going to come out in the next issue.
How good is that?
I was quite pleased. And in this small letter, one line that I liked was where she said, Adam Thirlwell may be a genius, which I thought was rather good. And then she said, however, if he chooses placelessness, as he obviously wants to, he will only be a literary blur. And so what you have here is one literary blur. And then she said the interesting line where she said, people are born wholes, not halves. And this struck me as just fundamentally untrue, that you can be born multifariously, that you can, and there seems to be something interesting in the denial of that idea that I think was what we wanted to kind of explore.
Yes, I think in fairness we have to look historically to some extent, and I mean you're a little bit younger than me, but certainly up until the early part of my adult life, and I don't know if this chimes with people who are here, it was infrequent but not totally uncommon to hear casual anti-Semitic remarks among, Gentiles in England. You would hear them. My memory of that sort of dying out is in the 1980s. But every time one heard an anti-Semitic remark casually made, you had a choice in terms of identity, which was either to express your Jewish identity or to, in a sense, deny it by your silence. So I think certainly for older people here, they will be much, much more familiar with that experience. So in a sense, you can argue that the status of the half or the demi-Jew is a status that one can only really aspire to in the actual anti-Semitism. So it's a kind of slightly paradoxical.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, I can remember about 2 casual anti-Semitic remarks I think I've probably ever heard in my life. There was one point I remember talking to someone who, trying to explain about some friend of theirs, he said, well, he does have very Jewish teeth. And I've never really understood, was this a compliment about his teeth? And it's true, but then this is, I think, a very interesting category where Jewishness is often formed almost against anti-Semitism. And it's actually one of the things that I was thinking of when we were thinking about this talk, that Sartre, in his book he wrote about Jewishness many, many years ago, said that it's the anti-Semite who makes the Jew, and that it's almost as if the Jewish identity is created by the person who kind of creates the stereotype and creates the thing against which you have to defend yourself.
Yes, I think that's true, but then you can look at it in terms of the diaspora as well. I mean, we're here in London, and one of the most significant course of the history of English Jewry was the impact of the pogroms in the 1880s and 90s and this enormous inundation of East European Jews, and of course the reaction of, at that time, as it were, indigenous English Jews to the arrival of these shtetl Jews, as they were characterized, and an enormous ambivalence about that arrival, particularly among Sephardic aristocratic English families who were incredibly well assimilated by that point.
Well, actually, because I think in the Jewish half of my family, there's an interesting, I think, dichotomy where part of the Jewish family were much more well-established Jews who had been there for centuries, but then the most recent strand came in the late 19th century from Lithuania. And I've always been intrigued by this kind of mingling of a very British type of Jewishness with a kind of a more recent, the more shtetl type of Jewishness, and kind of what that relation is.
Well, I think it's difficult to broadly characterize it, but I've been reading about this very recently, and it seems that the attitude initially was one of and then there was an acceptance of a fait accompli on the part of the English Jews who were already there, and there started to be these kind of religious missions, and new synagogues opened in the East End, and a sort of, we can't beat them, so we may as well let them join us attitude towards the new diaspora. But where does that leave us as writers, and where does that leave us?
Self-hating. Yeah, and I think the question of what a Jewish writer is, I mean, I've always been intrigued. Often when we talk about a French writer, a German writer, what you mean is the language in which they are writing. And obviously Jewishness, because of its diaspora history, would you only be a proper Jewish writer if you were writing in either Hebrew or Yiddish? What's the status of writing in a language that doesn't have that kind of link to a nation in the same way? And I think one of the people we wanted to talk about was Kafka, and Kafka is obsessed by this, that he was writing in German. And he has a really interesting image, Jewish writers writing in German, where he says, with their kind of, and then he has this extraordinary image where he says, but with their back legs, they are still stuck in Jewishness, while they're with their front legs, they are kind of flailing in the air. So it's an extraordinary insect image of a really horrible kind, which is very interesting in Kafka, because then it immediately links to kind of the metamorphosis where there's a kind of someone becomes a cockroach, and then at the end of the trial where Joseph K. is described as someone, as basically an insect flailing. And so obviously for Kafka, this question of language was huge, that in some way he also talks somewhere in one of his diaries that the word Mutter, mother, is not his word, that he can't use it without feeling that there's almost something comical about describing a Jewish mother, his own mother, in this way. Which has always struck me as, I think, typically for Kafka, it's very sensitive to language and what that would... I don't know where it leaves him as a writer.
Well, I mean, I think you may know more on this than I do, but I think the Kafka family were assimilated to the extent that Yiddish wasn't spoken in the home at all, as far as I'm aware. In fact, they were bilingual, but in Czech and German, and a very, very particular kind of German, which was Czech German, not German German. So I think when Germans read Kafka, they're immediately struck by how Czech it is. They're not conscious of it necessarily. And there's hideousness about his writing in Czech German that, you know, isn't commensurate with somebody who had Yiddish in their linguistic background.
Yeah. I mean, he actually writes, because there was Yiddish theatre in Prague at the time, and there's a very interesting lecture he gives introducing a sort of evening of Yiddish theatre to basically an assimilated German Jewish-speaking audience, where he has this extraordinary phrase where he says, you must not be scared of this Yiddish. You know, if you kind of relax, you will realize that you can actually this strange, barbaric tongue. And so he has a kind of, definitely for him, Yiddish it both attracted him as something that was in a way, I don't know, a more sincere language or something that he could identify with, but he never saw it. Yeah, and it was almost a foreign language for him.
Well, it was, and it's the same paradigm that we're talking about in terms of English Jewry, that the sense, even in Prague, of assimilated German-speaking Jews would have been of the Jews from the East, being alien and different in that way, and threatening to some extent. Yeah. But it's not so much in Kafka's language, or maybe Kafka is the paradigmatic example that we cannot speak of Jewish writers in relation to language, because Kafka stands as the great, sort of prescient writer about the Holocaust, the great understander. And, you know, for those, Steiner said, that he stood in relation to the 20th century as Shakespeare did to the Renaissance, so his influence is, in a way, incalculable. And I was that kind of quality of prescience, his understanding not only of the coming Holocaust, but of the coming Kafkaesque character of late 20th century society that marks him out in that way. So if we take Kafka as, in some sense, to be a paradigmatic Jewish writer, then he is a world writer at the same time. So maybe we shouldn't confine ourselves in that way. I mean, I know you're interested in this idea of Roth and Baz, Jewish writers that in a sense create Jewish characters who are fully assimilated in that way. But the same could be said of Kafka. I mean, you never know whether Joseph K. is Jewish or whether... There is no indication as to the status of the characters at all. Gregor Samsa, one's never aware of him.
No, for sure.
Possibly the new tenants that are invited in are Jewish in Metamorphosis. They're typed as having long beards.
Right. I don't remember that. And is a long beard the signal?
I've no idea, but there's it's significant that that's played on a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think for maybe why Kafka is kind of... It still seems to me that there's something in Kafka that almost is in danger of being lost. And it's in this kind of way in which he is the world writer. And he talks about, I think what he represents is a way of thinking about what assimilation really means. And what identity means. And I think he's much more some of his later interpreters have wanted him to be. Because he's interested in both the sort of difficulty of assimilating and also the way in which that creates a kind of a complicated identity, and trying to kind of keep hold of both at once seems to me a very Kafkaesque problem.
What it puts me in mind of is the idea that this thing is moving in some kind of dialectical process. That really, before the Shoah, if you take Prague, after the 1920s, maybe that was a situation in some sense analogous to the situation we had here in the 1960s. So that these things move through cycles of assimilation, anxiety about assimilation, and then, in the case of the Shoah, a dreadful cataclysm that forces a new set of polarities and a new set of awarenesses on Jewish writers, which rather begs the question, where are we now in the absence of a similar cataclysm, and in a way manufactured one, that there is a kind of latency about the situation with regard to Israel that represents the same thing in relation to Jewishness and Jewish identity for contemporary writers. Does that chime with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is really what you think of as a victim